So let's say a Martian comes down to Earth, Washington, D.C. to be precise, and you tell this Martian that you are going to let it look at 4 American politicians, only 4, and from the words and actions of these 4 politicians, you want this Martian to estimate how many political parties there are in the United States, because this is a Martian that understands democracy. So you'll introduce it to the words and actions of AOC. You'll introduce it to the words and actions of President Biden, to the words and actions of Susan Collins, and the words and actions of President Trump. So given these 4 very different politicians with very different views, different words, different actions, would our Martian assume that there are only 2 viable parties in the United States? Or would the Martian say there are probably 4? Because as we know, there are actually only 2 of these parties. AOC and Biden work together in one party, and Senator Collins and Donald Trump are in the other party. Because when it comes down to it, the 2 main political parties in the United States are coalitions, right? The Democrats and the Republicans are kind of umbrella organizations that bring together what might otherwise be several different parties. So AOC and Biden are under one umbrella called Democrats, and Collins and Trump are under another umbrella called Republicans. And the main thing you need to remember about the difference between American elections and Israeli elections is that in America you form the coalitions, the umbrella organizations, you form them before anyone votes. Okay, you form the 2 big umbrella organizations, the Democrats and the Republicans, and then the voter votes for one umbrella or the other. In Israel, first we vote for some 20 different parties, and then, after the results have been counted, then we create the umbrella coalition. Okay, so our last government had 8 political parties together in one ruling coalition umbrella, with altogether 13 parties in the Knesset, in the Senate and the House put together. How does it go? All the votes are counted, and they are distributed according to the percentage of votes. Okay, so you get 10% of all the votes, you get 10% of the seats in the Knesset. You got 50% of all the votes, you get half of all the seats in the Knesset. The Knesset has 120 seats, half of 120 is 60. No one party has ever reached 60 seats or more on its own. So parties always have to come together under a single umbrella, an umbrella coalition, to get over that threshold of 61. Whoever leads a group of 61 plus MKs, members of Knesset, forms the governing coalition and becomes Prime Minister. That is, I become Prime Minister if I manage to gather together a large enough umbrella to reach over 60 seats. So far, so relatively simple. Now let's look at the issues. What values go into building these coalitions? So there are 3 main issues when we're talking about the Israeli elections. Generally speaking, there are always 3 main issues with an additional one. And the way that we can represent them is something like a sliding scale. So it's not one or the other, it's somewhere along the line. So the first sliding scale is about a Palestinian state. Should we act towards creating a Palestinian state? And the sliding scale goes from we should never create a Palestinian state, or we should have one now immediately. And the different parties place themselves at different places along this continuum. The second issue is about the economy. Should we be looking out for the freedom of people to succeed or fail economically? Or should we be looking out for the welfare of all people, irrespective of whether they succeed or don't? And so this would be divided along the sliding scale of free market on one end and full welfare on the other end. And the third issue, in Israel in particular, is about religion and state. And here we might say that there are those who say religion and state should be entirely separate, and there are those who say that religion and state should be one thing. There should be a religious state, full stop. And again, there are parties that find themselves at different points along this continuum. So how is a coalition made? Well, ordinarily we would think that a coalition is made if you agree with each other. But it doesn't always work like that in Israel, because how you think about one particular sliding scale is not necessarily how you might think on another sliding scale. Some parties are very consistent. So, for example, the Likud party is towards the right on a Palestinian state, is towards the right on what kind of economy we should be, and is towards the right about what kind of relationship there should be between religion and state. But, for example, another party, Yahadut HaTorah, represents the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. So Yahadut HaTorah on religion and state is way to the right. It wants a great connection between the religion and the state. In terms of the Palestinian state, Yahadut HaTorah is center-right. But in terms of economy, Yahadut HaTorah is very much in favor of welfare. In particular, folks who study Torah rather than work, they should receive government support. So looking at this, you would say, okay, so they're probably not going to be in a coalition together, Likud and Yahadut HaTorah. However, that's when we realize that coalitions are made up of common ground and compromise. So whilst Yahadut HaTorah may see that welfare is extremely important, we can see that Likud, it's on the free market thing, they're a little bit smaller. And the most important thing for Likud, you can see up in the top scale, Likud, its most important thing, written in the largest font, is about the Palestinian state. And for Yahadut HaTorah, you can see that it's in a very small font. That is, this is what they believe, but it's less important to them than welfare and a strong connection between religion and state. And so, in this way, if Likud can say to Yahadut HaTorah, all right, we'll support you in terms of welfare, and we don't care all that much about religion and state, it's not that important to us, so we'll make compromises for you there, so long as you, Yahadut HaTorah, support us to do with the Palestinian state, then we can be in the same coalition. And that's how coalitions are built. Common ground, but where there isn't common ground, compromise on what is less important to me than other issues. Now, the previous 3 or 4 elections between 2019 and 2021 had a new scale involved. And this scale was about Benjamin Netanyahu, often known as Bibi. And the question was, should a sitting prime minister be indicted? And then later on, should someone who has been indicted, as Prime Minister Netanyahu has been, should that person ever become a prime minister? And again, sliding scale, those who say this should never happen, and those who say Bibi is our king. And this has brought about a very different scaling. Because, for example, we can look at Likud. We've seen that Likud is mostly to the right and is certainly in favour of Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, being their leader. And then along comes a new party called New Hope. They completely agree with the Likud on religion and state. They agree with Likud on the economy. They agree with Likud on the Palestinians. However, what's really important to them is that Benjamin Netanyahu should never be prime minister. And therefore, because that's the most important thing for New Hope, there's no way that they can be in a coalition with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And now, I would suggest that there's a new scale coming up, that the Benjamin Netanyahu it's kind of baked into everyone's understandings. It's not the key issue. It's the key issue which defines the parties perhaps, but not the voters. A new scale is going to be about the question of whether there should be an Arab party in government or not.